The gate at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado opened at 0600 and closed at 2200, and in the 16 hours between those times, the person standing at Gate Post Alpha was responsible for checking credentials, managing vehicle flow, controlling access to a facility that trained the most elite maritime force on Earth, and maintaining the specific kind of visible military bearing that the Navy expected from the people who represented its front-facing presence to the world outside the fence. She had been assigned to Gate Post Alpha. The assignment came from a chief petty officer named Rollins, who had decided, based on a review of her temporary duty orders, that the gate was the appropriate placement for a service member whose documentation he could not fully read, whose actual function at the base was not clear to him, and who had arrived at his facility with a level of classification on her personnel record that he was not read in on and therefore chose to interpret as absence of significance. He had looked at the folder cover. He had seen a classification level stamped in a color he associated with personnel records that involved administrative complexity, personnel undergoing security reviews, personnel in sensitive support roles, personnel whose records had been flagged for one reason or another. He had made a determination. "You're going to work the gate," he told her, in the manner of a man delivering a verdict he has considered and confirmed is correct. She had looked at him for a moment, not a long moment, not the kind of moment that asked him to reconsider. Just a moment, the brief pause of a person whose internal processing had completed and was ready to respond. She did not argue. She did not explain. She did not present the folder in her kit that would have made him go very quiet very fast, that would have changed the temperature in the room and changed the assignment and changed everything about the next 4 days. She could have presented it. It would have taken 10 seconds. It would have been entirely within her rights. She didn't. "Yes, Chief," she said. She went to the gate. What the gate had seen in her 4 days was the following: 472 vehicle entries and exits logged correctly, 1 credential reader maintenance note, 6 secondary field notations on credential anomalies, 1 vehicle type mismatch documented and flagged, a 7-page security assessment that identified 3 distinct procedural gaps, 1 systemic access control vulnerability, and 1 proposed credential category revision, all produced in the margins of a gate assignment that required her full attention for approximately 40% of each shift on the structural analysis that would eventually produce the assessment. She ran 2 things simultaneously without apparent effort. She always had. What Chief Petty Officer Rollins did not know was contained in a folder with a classification level he had never been read in on, in a personnel record that had been deliberately compartmentalized to prevent exactly the kind of casual access that would make his gate assignment seem absurd. What the folder contained was 2 years of maritime direct action operations, conducted under a program that officially was called something administrative and unofficially was called nothing at all, because the people who ran it. Programs with no name were harder to cut and harder to target and harder to discuss in congressional oversight hearings, and the people who ran this one had learned from watching other programs with names disappear. What the folder contained was a combat dive certification from a program that accepted a maximum of 4 candidates per year and routinely graduated fewer than that, sometimes 1, sometimes none. The program existed to find people who could operate at depth under conditions that standard dive training did not replicate, in environments that the standard dive community did not operate in, doing things that the standard dive community did not do. She had certified in the program's most demanding cycle. Not the first time she applied, the third. The first 2 times she had been turned away at the screening stage, not for performance deficiencies, but because the program had already filled its slot count and she was not the person with the most direct pathway in. She had continued training at her own expense, at her own initiative, at a level that the program screening cadre noted in their files with the specific notation they reserved for candidates who were serious about the preparation. The third time she applied, the slot was there and she filled it. She completed the program. The certification went into the folder. The folder also contained something that had no formal field to document it. The quality that the program's selection cadre had written about in their informal notes and shared in conversations between official assessment cycles. The quality they tried to describe and found that language was imprecise, for they tried words like composure, endurance, adaptability, tactical intelligence. None captured it individually. Together they pointed at something they all recognized when they saw it in a candidate. The quality of a person who was built for the work at a fundamental level, not just trained for it, but oriented toward it in a way that meant the work was. Rollins had looked at the folder cover. The folder cover told him nothing. He had assigned her to the gate. The gate post was a small structure at the entry point to the base's operational compound. Not the main visitor entrance, but the access road that led to the training facilities, the dive tanks, the buttis grinder, the places where selection happened and operators were made and broken and made again. The structure had a credential reader, a standard log terminal, a vehicle weight sensor for oversized load alerts, and a position marker for the gate guard. A spot of pavement that was understood as where you stood when you were not actively processing a vehicle, where you maintained the bearing that the job required, where you were visible. She stood at the position. She stood there with the bearing of someone who had been trained to stand in positions that were significantly less comfortable than this one and maintain full function regardless. She had stood in cold water to her chest for hours, while her mind was required to run navigation calculations and communication protocols and threat assessments. She had stood in desert heat in 70 pounds of kit for 8-hour intervals. She had stood in places where standing was itself a tactical decision. This was a gate post in Coronado with a credential reader and a log terminal. She was fine. She ran the gate with the same completeness she ran everything. Within the first hour, she had mapped the vehicle traffic pattern, the timing intervals, the vehicle categories, the approximate percentage of inbound versus outbound traffic in the 06002. She had assessed the sightlines from the gate structure in all 4 directions. She had identified the secondary notation field in the log terminal that the previous gate personnel had apparently not been using. She also noted within the first hour that the credential reader had a 3-second lag between scan and confirmation that was longer than the manufacturer specification. She logged it as a maintenance note in the secondary field. Whether the maintenance note was reviewed was not her problem. The note was in the log was the record. The first vehicles came through at 0601, a SEAL platoon returning from a night water evolution. 2 trucks, wet, cold, done. The operators presented their credentials on reflex, in the manner of people running on the tail end of a long night and conserving attention for recovery. She processed each credential, confirmed the log entry. The operator at the window of the first truck glanced at her as he pulled forward. He didn't say anything, but something registered. Something in the specific way she stood at the position. Not alert in the hyper-vigilant sense, but present in a different way. In the way of someone who was tracking everything within their observation radius. He drove on. The morning at Coronado had a quality that she registered with precision. The Pacific Ocean was 300 meters from the gate, and at 0600, the salt air and the pre-dawn cold combined to produce a temperature that most people described as uncomfortable. She had trained in water colder than anything this coast produced. She had been in the North Sea in January. She had been in water temperatures that required her to complete underwater objectives before her hands passed the threshold into non-functional. Not before she was cold, but before her fine motor control began to degrade. She had timed that threshold on herself. She knew it to the minute. This Coronado morning was well inside any threshold that mattered. She stood at the gate. She processed vehicles. She maintained the log. At 0823, a vehicle came through that she registered differently, not the vehicle itself, a standard military sedan, but the way it moved, the way it slowed on the approach, the way the driver positioned relative to the gate structure without being asked or directed. These were small tells. They were not random. They were the product of a specific kind of training, the training of a driver who had spent significant time in access control environments at a high level. She checked the credential. She processed the information on the credential without changing her expression. The person in the passenger seat was looking forward, not at her, forward. She said, "Good morning, sir." She logged the entry. She waved the vehicle through. She tracked it in her peripheral vision as it moved toward the administrative building. She returned to position. She continued the log. Lieutenant Commander Hargrove ran his platoon out of a briefing room 200 meters from Gate Post Alpha, and after his first encounter with her at the gate, he had done something that was not standard procedure. He had pulled a contact at a command he was not going to name in any document and asked a question. The question was simple. The answer was not. "Who put her at the gate?" the contact asked. Hargrove told him a pause. The kind of pause that happens when the person on the other end has processed an answer and is deciding how much of their response to share. She's there because the person who placed her there doesn't know who she is. That is the entirety of the situation. The placement was made in informational absence. He looked at the folder and saw something he couldn't read and determined that meant something he was wrong about. "She's just going to stand at the gate until someone with the right information fixes it," the contact said. "Yes, that is what will happen. And while she's there, the gate will be covered at a level that the gate has probably never been covered at, because she doesn't do incomplete jobs. You could put her anywhere, and the anywhere would function at the highest available standard." Hargrove thought about that. He thought about the operator who had driven through the gate on day one and later told him, carefully, in a private conversation, that something about the person at the gate had registered as off, but not wrong. Often the way a thing is off when it doesn't fit the context, when the context is missing the information that would make it fit correctly. "Does the commander know?" Hargrove asked. "He's going to know," the contact said. The question is, timing. What can I do? Nothing that's yours to do, the contact said. But you can make sure that when the commander knows he has all of it, not just the placement. The 4 days Hargrove understood. He started keeping notes. On day 3, at 0931, a maintenance vehicle came through the gate. White, non-standard markings for a facility vehicle of its type. The driver presented credentials that were valid. The credential reader confirmed them. The log cleared them. The vehicle type matched the category on the credential at a surface level. She passed it through, but she logged it with a secondary notation. The notation was 3 words in a field that most gate operators left blank because it was optional. Vehicle type mismatch. The credential authorized access for routine maintenance vehicles. Category 4. The vehicle was physically configured as a Category 3. Smaller cargo capacity, different equipment mount points. Not the kind of thing that would trigger a flag under normal logging practice, just a small discrepancy between what the credential said and what was in front of her. She noted it because she noted everything. At 11:43 that morning, the same vehicle attempted to re-enter. She ran the credential again. She pulled her own log. She cross-referenced the exit record. The re-entry was within the standard 45-minute secondary log window, the window that did not currently require a secondary check under existing procedure. She passed the vehicle through. The credential was valid, but she wrote up the access window gap in the formal assessment she was building, not as a dramatic vulnerability, as a procedural gap with a specific timeline characteristic and a simple fix. The 45-minute secondary check window was too long. It should be 15. The flag threshold was too high. It should be lower. Simple to fix. Nobody had noticed it before. She had been at the gate for 60 hours. On day 4, Chief Petty Officer Rollins stopped at the gate on his morning rounds. He was a precise man who did precise rounds. The gate was on his route. He had a specific way of reviewing personnel at his gate that communicated that he was measuring standard and finding it acceptable or wanting. He looked at her. He found the standard acceptable. The log was clean. The credential reader had been initialized correctly each shift. The secondary notation field, which most gate personnel left blank, had entries he had not seen before, entries that appeared to be tracking something, though he hadn't read them closely enough to understand what. He also found something in his awareness that had been present since day 1, and was now more specific. The people who came through this gate knew each other, and the 4 days had not produced what he would identify as standard recognition. The operators who came through did not react to her the way personnel reacted to a gate guard, with casual transaction, with the disinterest of people who saw the gate as infrastructure. They reacted differently. Some of them slowed slightly before the gate, adjusted their approach, looked at her with more attention than the credential check required. Some of them looked in their mirrors after they drove through. He couldn't name what the reaction meant. He went on his rounds. At 0751, his phone rang. At 0748, on day 4, the command sedan returned. She registered the return approach. She did not react beyond standard gate procedure. She stepped to the vehicle, credential reader ready. The window came down. The rear admiral looked at her. She looked at him. He said her name. Not her rank, her name, the specific name, not the cover designation that appeared on the temporary duty orders Rollins had seen, but the name that was inside the folder. The name that would appear in a record accessible only to people read in at a level significantly above anything Rollins could have accessed. The name that meant, "I know who you are, and I have known since the moment I drove past this gate at 0743 this morning." She said, "Good morning, sir." The Admiral said, "How long have you been at this gate?" "4 days, sir." He was quiet for a moment. Not a long moment. The processing moment of a man who has arrived at the next step and is determining its structure. Who assigned you here? That was its own kind of reaction. The controlled absence of visible reaction in a person who is deciding how to handle information they find significant. "Stay at the gate," he said. The vehicle pulled forward. She logged the return entry in the standard field. She did not log anything else. Chief Petty Officer Rollins received a phone call at 0751 from a number he recognized as the Admiral's office and had never personally received a call from. The person on the call was the Admiral's Chief of Staff, Commander Voss, and the conversation lasted 4 minutes. Voss was precise. He was not unkind. He delivered information in the manner of someone who understood that the person on the other end had made an error without understanding they were making an error, and was now being given the understanding. He said, "The service member assigned to Gate Post Alpha has a personnel record classified at a level that was not accessible to the assigning CPO. He said the record reflects an operational background that makes a gate assignment an inefficient use of a significant asset. He said the service member is being reassigned to the command element effective end of current shift. He did not say, 'You should not have done this.' He did not say, 'This was an unacceptable placement.' He did not say, 'You have assigned one of the most operationally significant people on this base to check credentials at a gate for 4 days because you looked at a folder cover and drew the wrong conclusion.' He did not say any of those things because Voss was a precise man who said only what was necessary, and what was necessary was the factual information and the corrective action. Rollins said, 'Yes, sir.' He said, 'I didn't have access to' once, and then stopped when Voss did not pause to acknowledge it, because the acknowledgement was not the point of the call, and Rollins, he said, 'Yes, sir,' a final time. He hung up. He sat for 2 minutes. Then he went to the gate. At 0823, Commander Thomas Reyes walked up to Gate Post Alpha on foot, not in a vehicle, on foot. He had driven to the access road and gotten out of the vehicle 100 meters back and walked the rest of the way, which was not standard behavior for a commanding officer, and which he did because he wanted to see the gate before the gate could see his vehicle. He wanted to see her first. He stopped at the edge of the gate structure. She was processing an exit, a vehicle departing, credential scan, log entry, wave through. He watched her complete the process, watched her turn and register his presence. She registered him without changing expression. He was a person approaching the gate. She processed persons approaching the gate. He looked at her, not with the appraising look of a superior assessing a subordinate, not with the weight of a formal evaluation, with the specific look of a person who has reviewed a record and is now looking at the record in front of them and understanding the distance between what the record describes and where they are standing. He saluted her, not the casual salute of a superior to subordinate transaction, not the perfunctory gesture of rank acknowledged and moved past. The deliberate, full, held salute of a military officer choosing to perform the action as an act of recognition, conscious, intentional, held for a moment longer than the minimum. She returned the salute at the same level of deliberateness. He held it. Then he dropped his hand. "I apologize for the gate," he said. She looked at him steadily. Her expression did not carry the vindication he might have expected. It was the same expression she had brought to every credential check in 4 days. Present, neutral, clear. "The gate was adequately covered, sir," she said. He almost smiled. Something moved across his face that was adjacent to a smile and adjacent to something older and more complex. Something like recognition, not of her record, but of the specific quality of a person who has spent years doing the actual work without requiring the world to configure itself correctly around them. "Yes," he said, "it was." He walked through the gate. The 2 operators from his security element, who had been standing 30 meters back, had not moved. They had watched the salute. They had watched it in the way that people watch something they will not forget, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Because the gesture was real, and the reason for it was visible in the specific way that true things are visible to people trained to observe. They did not say anything. They would remember. She was at the position. A vehicle was entering. She processed the entry, logged it, waved it through, and returned to position before she acknowledged his presence. Not to ignore him, but because the gate didn't pause for supervisory visits. He had the look of a man who has been informed of something he cannot fully see yet, who is trying to reconcile the information with what is visible in front of him and finding the reconciliation imperfect. She did not look remarkable. She looked exactly as she had looked for 4 days, present, professional, functioning at full standard. That was, Rollins was beginning to understand the point. He had expected, when he got the call, to feel the relief of a problem being solved. The service member he had misplaced would be correctly placed, and the misplacement would be corrected, and the administrative error would be behind him. That was the structure of these situations. They resolved. What he had not expected was the specific feeling of standing at the gate at 0831 and looking at the person he had placed here and understanding for the first time, not abstractly but concretely, what 4 days of this had actually cost. Not in terms of her discomfort. He had no evidence of her discomfort. In terms of what the Navy had missed. 4 days of having something significant pointed at a gate when it could have been pointed at something else. 4 days of a resource being used at a fraction of its capacity. That was the cost. It was not a dramatic cost. Nothing had gone wrong. The gate had been covered. The mission had not been affected. But the cost was real, and it was a waste. And Rollins was a precise man. And precise men did not find waste comfortable, even when the waste produced no visible damage. "There's been a change in your assignment," he said. "Yes, Chief," she said. He was quiet. He had expected something from the interaction, had expected it without consciously knowing he expected it. Something in the way she received the news. Some evidence of the 4 days, some acknowledgement of what it had cost her to stand at a gate that did not fit her record. She gave him nothing of that. She was at the gate. That was the condition. She had been inside the condition for 4 days, and she would be inside it until it changed. "You'll be attached to the command element," he said. "Effective end of shift." "Yes, Chief." He looked at her for another moment. "The security assessment you wrote?" he said. "I read it this morning." She said nothing. It was... He started. He stopped. He was trying to find the word, and finding that the word was not available to him in the current context. "It was complete," he said finally. "Thank you, Chief," she said. He left. The security assessment she had produced over 4 days at Gate Post Alpha was 7 pages long. It identified the 45-minute secondary log window and its implications. It identified the vehicle type discrepancy that had appeared on day 3 and cross-referenced the credential category structure that had produced it. It identified 3 additional procedural gaps in the access control protocol. Gaps that were not acute vulnerabilities, but that represented the accumulated drift of a procedure that had not been formally reviewed in a period that the documentation date suggested was longer than recommended. It included a section on the behavioral patterns of personnel transiting the gate, not intelligence on specific individuals, but aggregate pattern data on transit timing, vehicle categories, and frequency distributions that she had assembled from 4 days of log entries combined with visual observation. The aggregate pattern data had an operational implication that she noted precisely. The gate's traffic pattern had a predictable peak and trough cycle that was visible from the access road, and that in a different threat environment would represent an observation target for adversarial access planning. She noted that Coronado was a domestic facility with a low probability external threat environment. She noted the pattern anyway. It was the kind of thing you noted. She also included a proposed revision to the credential category structure, not a complete overhaul, but a targeted fix that would close the vehicle type gap by adding a secondary physical characteristic check to the Category 4 credential processing flow. The revision required no new technology. It required a procedural addition that would add approximately 12 seconds per applicable vehicle